Imagine living in the 19th century, a time when mankind was proud of its great achievements. Railroads crossed the continent. Giant factories changed the landscape, and vast cities sprang up like mushrooms after a rain. But did you know that these very achievements also created the perfect environment for the most brutal predators in human history? The Victorian era was not only a time of progress and civilization, but also the age that gave birth to the first serial killers of the modern world. As industrial cities grew, they became vast mazes where criminals could disappear into the crowd. New transportation systems allowed them to move quickly between different areas, while primitive investigative methods could not keep up. It was the perfect storm for serial crime to flourish, and from it came names that would terrify the world: Jack the Ripper, H.H. Holmes, Amelia Dyer. I believe that to truly understand the nature of crime, we must confront humanity's darkest stories, not out of morbid curiosity, but because, from these tragedies, we learn valuable lessons about how to protect society from predators. Each case I am about to tell you is not just a horror story, but also a turning point in the history of forensic science and modern criminal investigation. London, 1888. The heart of the British Empire, and also the place where the darkest corners of horror are hidden. In the poor Whitechapel neighborhood, where despair and vice creep through every narrow alley, a predator has appeared. 5 women, 11 weeks a killer, who will become the prototype of the modern serial killer. I often wonder what has made Jack the Ripper so mysteriously fascinating for over a century. Perhaps it is because he represents our most primal fears, a killer who cannot be caught, cannot be identified, and most importantly, cannot be understood. He is the embodiment of chaos in a world trying to become civilized. The massacre began in the early morning hours of August 31st, 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old woman struggling with poverty, was found with her throat slashed and her stomach savagely disemboweled. Just a week later, Annie Chapman was found in a backyard on Hanbury Street, her throat slashed, her stomach cut open, and several internal organs removed with surgical precision. What haunts me most about these cases is not just the brutality, but the systematicity. These are not impulsive murders, but carefully planned acts that demonstrate a knowledge of anatomy and a cold, terrifying mentality. This killer not only wanted to kill, but also wanted to exert absolute control over his victims. The night of 30th September became a night of double incidents. 2 women were murdered within an hour of each other. Elizabeth Stride was found with her throat slashed, but not disemboweled, perhaps because the killer had been cut off. Catherine Eddowes was murdered in a secluded square, her body brutally disemboweled with her kidneys and part of her uterus removed. I think what was really scary about Jack the Ripper was not just the murders, but the way he played with the public psyche. Letters sent to newspapers, claims to come from Jack the Ripper, a name that will echo through history. He was not just a murderer, but a master of crowd psychology who knew how to create collective fear. The final and most brutal murder occurred on November 9th. Mary Jane Kelly, only 25 years old, unlike the other victims who were murdered in public, was murdered in her own room. The scene that police discovered in the small room in Miller's Court was described as more like a slaughterhouse than a crime scene. And then, silence. The Ripper disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving behind one of history's most enduring mysteries. For more than a century, investigators and historians have analyzed every detail, coming up with hundreds of potential suspects. A royal physician, a mad artist, a Polish barber. The debate continues to this day, but I believe that Jack the Ripper's influence extends far beyond his unsolved identity. The Ripper case revolutionized criminal investigation, transformed the way the media reported on crime, and set the tone for how we understand serial killers. In his bloody wake, policing will never be the same. While Jack the Ripper terrorized London, another killer was operating in quiet obscurity across the English countryside. Her victims were some of society's most vulnerable, and her victim count may have surpassed that of any other serial killer in British history. Amelia Elizabeth Dyer, widow, nurse midwife, and murderer of approximately 400 babies over a 30-year period. I believe her story shows another dark side of Victorian society, hypocrisy, and its terrible consequences. In Victorian England, unmarried mothers faced an unbearable stigma. With no social safety net, many turned to babysitters, women who promised to care for unwanted children or find them adoptive families, all for a fee. Dyer, trained as a nurse, saw an opportunity in desperation. She charged up to $80 in today's money ostensibly to care for the child. But her business model was brutally efficient. Once the mother left and payment was secured, most of the babies were killed immediately. Her methods were simple and cold strangulation with white tape, which became her signature. The bodies were dumped in the Thames wrapped in paper parcels with bricks attached to them to sink them. The plot continued for decades, interrupted only by short prison sentences for neglect and stints in asylums. I think the most frightening thing about Amelia Dyer is not the number of her victims, but the way she exploited the desperation of women. She understood the structure of society and knew how to exploit its weaknesses. Every child she killed was not just a victim of hers, but also a victim of a society that failed to protect its most vulnerable. Dyer would simply move to a new location, change his name, and continue his grisly business. On March 30th, 1896, a boatman found a suspicious package in the Thames. Inside was the body of a young girl later identified as Helena Fry. The investigation led Police Constable Anderson to an extraordinary discovery. A faint address was visible on the sodden wrapping paper when examined under a microscope. Police surveillance of 76 Mayo Road in Reading led to Amelia Dyer. When they searched her home, they found more evidence of her crimes: white bandages, pawn tickets for baby clothes, letters from mothers asking about their children, and an overwhelming stench. In a small tin, police discovered the body of another newborn baby. I believe that Dyer's eventual confession, even though the true extent of her crimes remains unknown, demonstrates something important. Even the most cold-hearted killers can be overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of their crimes. Authorities estimate that she may have killed a baby every week for 30 years. At her trial, Dyer showed no remorse. When asked how many children she had killed, she is said to have replied, "You will never know. Thames does not tell the tale." On the 10th of June, 1896, Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison. Her case shocked Victorian England, leading to stricter adoption laws and increased scrutiny of childcare practices. But the grim reality remains: in a society where unwed motherhood was considered destructive, women like Dyer exploited desperate mothers for decades before ever facing justice. As London hunted the Ripper, and Britain shuddered at Dyer's crimes across the Atlantic, America's first acknowledged serial killer was building his own monument to death. A building designed not to shelter life, but to conceal death. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H.H. Holmes, charming, educated physician, businessman, conman, and architect of what newspapers later called the Murder Castle. I believe that Holmes represents a whole new kind of criminal, one who combines intelligence, charm, and systematic planning to create a killing machine. Between 1887 and 1891, Holmes built a 3-story building in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood. From the outside, it appeared to be just a drugstore, with rooms for rent, but inside it hid a maze designed to kill. The upper floors contained more than 100 windowless rooms entrances that opened onto brick walls, stairways that led nowhere, and hallways that ended in dead ends. I often wonder what kind of mentality it takes to design a building like this. This is not just impulsive brutality, but meticulously planned brutality. Holmes spent years creating the perfect environment for murder, and it shows a level of cold calculation that few can imagine. Some rooms were sealed and connected to gas lines that Holmes controlled from the main control panel. Others were equipped with alarms to alert him if guests attempted to escape. Most brutal were the slides that led from the upper floors straight down to the basement, where Holmes had installed acid vats, quicklime pits, and incinerators. When the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition brought thousands of visitors to Chicago, Holmes' castle was ready. He advertised rooms for rent targeting young women who came to the city alone, many of whom were never seen again. Holmes's confirmed victims include his lover Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl, his secretary Emmeline Segrande, and sisters Minnie and Nanny Williams, whose fortune Holmes coveted. But these confirmed victims likely represent only a fraction of his true total. I think the most terrifying thing about Holmes is not the number of people he killed, but the way he turned murder into an industrial process. He was not just a murderer, but a manufacturer of death, applying modern business principles to murder. Holmes's downfall began with an insurance scam. In 1894, he murdered business partner Benjamin Pitezel as part of a $10,000 scam. Not satisfied with this single murder, Holmes later convinced Pitezel's widow to let her 3 children travel with him. Holmes took Howard Nellie and Alice Pitezel on a spiraling journey across the United States and Canada. One by one, the children disappeared. Howard was found dismembered in a house in Indianapolis, while the girls' bodies were discovered buried in a basement in Toronto. Arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894. Holmes initially faced only fraud charges. But, as investigators dug deeper, the horrific scope of his crimes was revealed. While he was only formally convicted of the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, Holmes confessed to 27 murders, although he later claimed the true number was in excess of 130. On May 7, 1896, H. Holmes was hanged at Philadelphia's Moyamensing prison. His final request was that his body be buried in concrete to prevent dissection, an odd concern for a man who had dissected so many others. Holmes's murder castle burned down under mysterious circumstances in 1895. All that remained was the first-floor pharmacy. The site is now occupied by a post office, although some claim that eerie sounds still emanate from its basement. Perhaps echoes of horrors buried in American history, while H. Holmes operated in the urban shadows of Chicago. Another American horror was unfolding on the vast frontier. In the newly settled Labette County of Kansas, a family of 4 established a small inn and general store along the Osage Trail in 1871. Few stopped there to continue their journey. The Bender family, Father John, Mother Elmira, son John Jr., and daughter Kate provided the weary travelers with a meal and a place to rest. Their cabin was divided by a canvas screen with a small grocery and dining area in the front, and their own living quarters in the back. I believe the Bender family's story shows another horrifying aspect of crime when an entire family joins in on the killing. This is not just individual brutality, but brutality organized as a family business. Kate, the most glamorous member of the family, advertised herself as a psychic and healer. Young, attractive, and educated, she lured visitors with promises of seances and healings. Meanwhile, the other family members spoke broken English and were not particularly friendly. Their method of murder was meticulously planned. A guest, usually a man traveling alone with money, would be invited to sit at dinner, with his back to a cloth curtain. The seat of honor was placed precisely above a trap door. During the meal, one of the Benders would emerge from behind a curtain and strike the victim over the head with a hammer. The throat would then be slit to ensure death. The body would be lowered through a trap door into the basement below. Then, under cover of darkness, The Benders would bury their victim in the orchard behind the cabin, usually after stripping it of valuables. Their downfall began with the disappearance of Dr. William York, who disappeared while searching for 2 other missing men. His brother, Colonel Alexander York, a prominent Kansas state senator, visited the Benders while investigating his brother's disappearance. Something about the family aroused his suspicions. In April 1873, the town held a meeting to organize a search of all the local farms. When it was their turn to check the Benders, they fled, disappearing into the night. What the searchers discovered at the abandoned Bender property horrified even the hardened men of the frontier. In the orchard behind the cabin, the ground had been disturbed in several places. As they dug, bodies emerged one by one, at least 11 victims, though some estimates put the true number as high as 21. I think what makes the Bender family case so particularly horrifying is not just the number of victims, but the way they turned murder into a normal family affair. They weren't just murderers, they were organized murderers, operating like a business with clear lines of work. All the victims had the same pattern: hammer blows to the head and slit throats. Among the dead was Dr. William York, whose brother's persistence eventually exposed the killers. A massive manhunt ensued, with a reward of $3,000 a fortune at the time. The Telegraph circulated the Benders' description across the country. Yet despite one of the most extensive manhunts in frontier history, the family seemingly vanished without a trace. Theories about their fate abound. Some believe that vigilantes captured and killed them, burying their bodies in unmarked graves. Others believe they escaped to another border region, or even fled to Europe. Despite numerous sightings and arrests of suspects, over the decades, the bloody Bender family was never found, becoming one of the most enduring mysteries of the American frontier. Their cabin was torn down by looters, and their land was eventually reclaimed by the prairies. Serial killings were not limited to Britain and America. The Victorian era saw the emergence of ritual killers across the globe. Each was shaped by their own cultural context, but shared disturbing similarities. In the pastoral villages of France, Joseph Vacher wandered as a migrant worker from 1894 to 1897. Instantly recognizable by the facial paralysis caused by a failed suicide attempt, Vacher brutally murdered at least 11 men and women across the French countryside. I believe that Vacher represents a different kind of killer, one who exploits the vastness of the countryside rather than the anonymity of the city. Vacher's victims were shepherds and farm workers, often teenagers, whom he met in isolated locations. His attacks were frenzied and sexual in nature, often involving dismemberment and biting. Unlike urban killers, Vacher exploited the vast French countryside, disappearing across provincial boundaries after each murder. His arrest in 1897, after a botched attack, led to one of the first modern psychological evaluations of a serial killer. Forensic pioneer Alexandre Lacassagne conducted extensive tests, determining that despite Vacher's claims of insanity, he was legally sane and responsible for his actions. In Spain's Álava province, a seemingly ordinary farmer named Juan Díaz de Garay terrorized the region from 1870 to 1879. Known as El Sacamantecas, the fat extractor, Garay targeted women walking alone on rural roads. Garay's first victims were prostitutes, but he soon escalated to attacking any woman he encountered alone. His crimes were marked by extreme sexual violence and disembowelment. The nickname Sacamantecas comes from regional folklore about monsters that extracted human fat for magical purposes, a superstition Garay deliberately played on to throw authorities off guard. I found it interesting that Garay used folklore as a tool to cover up his crimes. This shows how calculated his actions were, and how killers can exploit cultural beliefs to create confusion. Not all Victorian murderers targeted the living. In the small French town of Mouy, Victor Ardisson violated the sanctity of death. While not technically a murderer, His homicidal crimes shocked even hardened investigators. Artisan, the town gravedigger, desecrated many graves between 1900 and 1901, primarily targeting newly buried young women and girls. He would take the bodies to his attic, perform sexual acts on them, and sometimes keep body parts as mementos. I think Artisan's case represents another terrifying aspect of the criminal mind, when the line between life and death is blurred in a sick mind. He violated not only the living, but also the dead. The Victorian murders didn't just leave a trail of victims, they forced the birth of modern crime investigation. Each of the cases we've examined has exposed critical flaws in existing systems and demanded new solutions. I believe that this is the real legacy of this era, not the brutality of the killers, but the progress born of the need to combat them. Before Jack the Ripper police relied primarily on eyewitness testimony and physical evidence observed with the naked eye. The Ripper's escape from capture highlighted key weaknesses: no coordinated approach to the crime scene, poor communication between jurisdictions, and minimal scientific analysis. The murder of Mary Kelly marked one of the first uses of crime scene photography in a serial murder investigation. Although crude by today's standards, these images began a transformation of evidence collection. Thomas Bond's attempt to create a profile of the Ripper based on crime scene evidence represents one of the earliest attempts at what we now call criminal profiling. The Amelia Dyer case demonstrated how examining microscopic evidence can crack a case. When Police Constable Anderson examined the sodden wrapping paper containing Helena Fry's body, he discovered a faintly visible address, a vital clue that led police to Dyer's door. I think this represents a pivotal turning point in the history of criminal investigation, when investigators began to realize that evidence could be found at the microscopic level not just through direct observation. Poisoning cases like Mary Ann Cotton's spurred the development of forensic toxicology. The Marsh test, developed in 1836 by James Marsh, provided the first reliable method for detecting arsenic poisoning, closing a loophole that had allowed poisoners to escape justice for centuries. Holmes's capture required unprecedented federal cooperation with the Pinkerton Detective Agency, using the telegraph to coordinate investigations across multiple jurisdictions. The case demonstrated that in an age of increased mobility, criminal investigations must transcend local boundaries. In France, the psychiatric evaluation of Joseph Vacher by Alexandre Lacassagne pioneered a scientific approach to understanding criminal psychology. Lacassagne's methodical and analytical documentation set a new standard for criminal psychology. Today's forensic science, from DNA analysis to geographic profiling to behavioral analysis, can trace its roots directly back to these Victorian murders. Each killer exploited gaps in the system. Each investigation struggled to adapt. And from these bloody lessons, modern criminal investigation emerged. As I studied these stories, I couldn't help but reflect on what they teach us about human nature and society. These killers are not supernatural monsters or mysterious phenomena. They are products of their circumstances, a combination of pathological individual psychology and the social conditions that allow them to thrive. I believe that the Victorian era created the perfect storm for mass crime, not by accident. Rapid urbanization created huge cities where people could disappear without anyone noticing. New transportation systems allowed for rapid movement between areas. Investigation methods were in their infancy, and social structures created vulnerable groups. The most terrifying thing I learned from these stories was not the brutality of individuals, but how society can inadvertently facilitate crime. Amelia Dyer could not have functioned without the social stigma attached to single mothers. Jack the Ripper exploited the poverty and vulnerability of women in Whitechapel. Holmes exploited the isolation of young women coming to the big city alone, but I also find hope in these stories. Each case led to important improvements in the way we protect society. Stricter adoption laws after the Dyer case, better police cooperation after the Ripper case, scientific investigative methods after the Holmes case. I think this is why we are still drawn to these stories, not because we have a morbid desire for violence, but because they represent important moments when humanity learns to confront its darkest aspects. These killers forced society to evolve. They exposed weaknesses we didn't know we had, and in the process they helped create a safer world for future generations. The Victorian era created the perfect conditions for serial killers to emerge and thrive. Growing cities offered anonymity. Inadequate police methods limited forensic capabilities, and social conditions that created vulnerable victims. Yet from this darkness has come light. Each of the cases we have examined has contributed to the development of modern criminal investigation techniques. The bloody legacy of these murderers is not only one of horror, but also of progress. Each crime has revealed important flaws that demand resolution. Jack the Ripper, Amelia Dyer, H. Holmes, the Bloody Benders family, and others across continents. These were not supernatural monsters, but human predators who exploited the systemic weaknesses and social vulnerabilities of their times. Our continuing fascination with these Victorian murderers is more than just a morbid curiosity. These cases mark the birth of our modern understanding of serial killing and the systems developed to combat it. By studying them, we can glimpse the origins of contemporary criminal psychology, forensic science, and investigative methods. I believe that the shadows of the Victorian era have never completely receded. They remind us that behind the facade of any civilization there lurk darker impulses, but they also remind us that we need not be helpless against them. From the darkest chapters of history come our most important lessons. These killers forced humanity to develop better tools of protection. They taught us that safety is not something to be taken for granted, but something to be actively protected through vigilance, science, and generosity. As the gaslight age gave way to electric lighting, so did policing's reliance on intuition give way to scientific discovery. The most famous murderers of the Victorian era didn't just take lives. They forced society to develop new tools to protect itself. In death, their victims became unwitting catalysts for a safer future. And perhaps that is the most important lesson we can learn from these dark stories, that even from the most horrific tragedies, people can learn, grow, and build a better world.